someone were to ask you, what kind of person do you believe God to be, how would you reply? Could you say that you admire such a God? Do you trust him? Could you say that you like him? Of course, some may feel that it's hardly appropriate to speak of liking God, of just liking someone so majestic and so far above us. But it seems to me there are many who say how much they love God, but they don't seem to be looking forward to meeting him, and they don't seem very excited about spending eternity with such a God. In other words, they don't really like him. It seems very important to me to decide, to discover whether or not one really likes one's God. I remember flying on the plane not long ago over the Atlantic when the cabin suddenly began to fill with smoke. It was right after the cocktail hour, when normally the conversation picks up quite a bit. But it suddenly became quiet, and a wave of fear swept through the plane. There was a tall physician standing near me in the aisle, a psychiatrist, in fact. And he leaned over and urgently inquired, I heard you talking about God to the lady in the seat ahead of you. What kind of person do you believe God to be? He seemed to be rather worried that if things didn't improve on the plane, he might be coming face to face with God at any moment. Well, to consider this question is the whole purpose of this series of discussions, to take another look at God. And I've invited Dr. Jonathan Gallagher to join me in these discussions, particularly to ask the questions people are raising about God these days. But first of all, let me ask you some questions about yourself. Before you went to St. Andrews, you were lucky to do that, to get your PhD in theology. You did other things first. You were in other lines of work. What did you do?
A number of different lines, but to begin with, I was a chemist.
You mean you sold medicines?
Oh, no, not that sort of chemist, not a pharmacist. I originally was an industrial chemist and specialized in space technology. I worked for Marconi Space on a number of different space programs, including some satellites, and later for a German company on the Space Lab program.
Over in the States, it's sometimes suggested that there is such a thing as an English accent. Now, we know there are many, many accents in these islands, and I enjoy every one of them. You remember in the famous musical, My Fair Lady, that the pompous Henry Higgins claimed that he could tell which block you were born in by your particular accent.
I think you'd have a hard job with me. I've moved around quite a bit.
Where were you born?
I was born in Hazelmere in Surrey, but we moved very early to Portsmouth, and so I spent most of my childhood there in good old Pompey, as it's called.
So anyway, you've been close to and you've worked with all kinds of people, and you should be well able to raise the questions that people are asking about God these days.
Yeah, many people are asking me questions about that.
That's
and perhaps for the first question, I can ask you what most people would want to know. What did you say to that doctor on the plane? How did you answer his question about God?
Well, in essence, in the smoke, I recall saying something like this: I believe that God is an infinitely powerful but equally gracious person who values nothing higher than the freedom and the dignity and the individuality of his intelligent creatures, that their love, their trust, their willingness to listen and obey may be freely given. Of a God like that, there is no need to be afraid.
Now, did the doctor ask you how you came to that conclusion?
No, because about that time the crew succeeded in putting out the fire, and as soon as the smoke was cleared, the doctor's anxiety about meeting God at any moment was relieved.
Understandably. So let me ask them, how do you know that God is that sort of person that you just described to us? How do we know you just didn't make it up out of thin air?
I would say that it came from the repeated reading of all 66 books of the Scriptures.
Ah, the Bible. And how can we know that the Bible can be trusted? And even if we do accept that the Bible is trustworthy, isn't it true that there are many other people who accept that the Bible is indeed trustworthy, but do not arrive at the same conclusions about the picture of God?
True.
So, if that is true, How can you be sure that you are correctly reading and understanding the Scriptures? And while we're asking questions like that, what about those people when you say, do you believe that God is like this? They say, well, I don't believe in a God at all. What would you say to them? How would you answer that question? I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. I'm an agnostic.
You've asked several important questions there. Let me take the last one first. If someone should say to me, I don't believe in God at all, what would I say? First of all, can I ask you, are there many people in England like that?
I should think so. On the latest results of polls and market research that has been done, church attendance comes out at about only 3%, membership about 10%. And as for those who actually do believe in God and accept Him, well, that's a figure that's very difficult to quantify. But I should think many people would say, well, I'm not sure there is a God there anyway.
Well, in conversation with someone who says he doesn't believe in God at all, I like to ask first, did you ever believe in God, perhaps as a child? And at that time, what was your God like? And did you like Him? And as often as not, the God they describe that they used to worship is one I wouldn't like myself. It seems to me that many of those who say they don't believe in God are saying that they just can't believe in a God who really isn't worth believing in at all anyway. And lonely as it is to live without God, it surely is not a wrong thing to do, to reject something that isn't true. I mean, think of the incredible variety of things that some of our fellow human beings have been willing to worship down through the years, even insects and reptiles. The ancient Egyptians even worshipped beetles. And I don't mean the ones from Liverpool, but real beetles, sometimes called scarabs. And I brought some of these along to show you here on the table. These are real scarabs, the kinds that the Egyptians venerated. If you look underneath, you'll see the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. But if you're a tourist, you're more likely to receive one this size. Again, if you look underneath the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Apostle Paul wrote something about those who worship things like beetles using the New English Bible. He said, they have made fools of themselves, exchanging the splendor of immortal God for an image shaped like mortal man, even for images like birds, beasts, and creeping things, like these beetles. Imagine the effect of worshiping something like this. Imagine gathering your family around the beetles and praying, dear Lord Beetle, bless Mommy, bless Daddy, help me to be like you. The trouble is, it tends to work that way. It seems to be a law of the mind that we become like the objects of our worship and admiration. Think what it would do to the minds of the people to worship things like crocodiles or Beelzebub, the god of flies. Even worse, the ancients used to worship deities called Baals, or one called Moloch, who demanded human sacrifice, even the sacrifice of infants, before they would bless the people. Imagine the effect on a mother as she handed over her baby to the priest to be offered to the idol and there to be burned in order to win the favor of such a hideous God. Do you think as she did this, she really liked her God? Imagine what it did to the minds of the people to worship a God like that. In the Old Testament, there's a psalm that describes what happens to people who worship such gods. Their idols are silver and gold, made by the hands of men. They have mouths that cannot speak, and eyes that cannot see. They have ears that cannot hear, nostrils and cannot smell. With their hands they cannot feel. With their feet they cannot walk, and no sound comes from their throats. Their makers grow to be like them, and so do all who trust in them. That's how dangerous it is to have a false picture of God. But coming on down through the centuries, think of all the people who have lived in terror of a God who would torture them and threaten to torture them for eternity if they do not love and obey him. This subject of torture in a place called hell had a fascination for many artists through the years. In fact, some of the most famous pictures ever painted deal with the exquisite tortures and horrors of hell. And not only Christian artists, but sometimes Chinese and Japanese and other artists as well.
Can I interrupt there, Graham, with a question? Isn't it true that the Bible itself describes the final destruction of sinners and the fire that burns forever and ever? Isn't it true that our pictures of hell come from the Bible?
Well, it's true that these eternally burning fires are mentioned in the Bible, and we need to look carefully at those descriptions, and particularly at the meaning of the words forever and ever. Mm-hmm. But the detailed horrors of hell depicted in some of these paintings are nowhere to be found in the Bible. Now, they are to be found in certain books that look like books in the Bible. These are called the New Testament apocryphal or hidden books. There are two of them called the Revelation of St. Peter and the Revelation of St. Paul, and Protestants and Catholics alike agree that these books do not belong in the Bible. And yet the descriptions of hell in those books have had quite an influence through the years. If you read them, you'll see descriptions of people hanging upside down over hot flames, some hanging by their tongues or other sensitive parts of the body, people being punctured or burned with hot irons, others being torn by animals or even by huge worms. And during all this eternal torture, the saints never cease crying how holy and righteous and just and good it is for God to be torturing forever these people who will not love and obey him. How could anyone love and trust a God like that? You certainly couldn't admire him. You certainly couldn't like him. Unless, of course, you had become the same kind of person yourself. And remember, it is a law that we become like the person we worship and admire. You see, if it's all right for God to use such terrible methods of torture in order to force people to do things his way, then why should not the worshipers of such a God use the very same methods? And so they have all down through the years. Think of all the cruelty that has been heaped upon the human race in the name of God and religion. Remember how Latimer and Ridley were burned at the stake by some of their fellow Christians right over here in Oxford, England. And remember the host of other Christians martyred in the flames. The thousands of others massacred, men, women, and little children. And the poor souls stretched taut on the rack and tortured in every conceivable way. One has only to visit the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum to see the lengths to which the human race has sunk in the cruelty of its treatment of its fellow men. And so much of this cruelty supposedly in the service of God. Now, if you look at the pictures of the Christians being burned to death at the stake, you will frequently notice clergymen holding out the cross to these people being so tortured. This pain is not being inflicted so much for punishment as it is rather to force the sufferer to admit his error and to terrify him into submitting to the Christians, their authority, the authority of the ones who were in power at the time. As if enforced agreement like that could possibly be pleasing to the God who values nothing higher than our freedom. Later, both in Europe and over in the New World, the same cruelty was shown by professed Christians in their treatment of women accused of being witches. Everything depends, you see, on the kind of person we believe our God to be. The Bible describes how the Apostle Paul, before he came to know God, was perfectly willing to use force in order to force the Christians to give up their newfound faith. He even helped with the stoning of Stephen, although watching it troubled him a great deal. Paul believed that he was using, in his persecution of the Christians and in his stoning of Stephen, precisely the methods God would use himself to have his own way. But then, after he met God on the Damascus road, he never used force again. Instead, from then on, he could say to those who disagreed with him, "Let everyone be fully persuaded in his own mind." Nebuchadnezzar in Old Testament times, and the story is told in the book of Daniel, he met this same God in a remarkable way. The story is told of him building a very large image, an idol. And he commanded all the people to get down on their knees and worship this heathen image. And he threatened them that if they would not kneel, he'd throw them into the burning fiery furnace. 3 Hebrew young men who were there refused. And they said to Nebuchadnezzar, "Our God is powerful enough to rescue us from the fire. In fact, even if he doesn't, we won't worship your image." And in fury, Nebuchadnezzar ordered that they be thrown into the burning fiery furnace. God, as you may know the story, rescued the 3 Hebrew youths. And Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed with the God of Israel that he issued a decree that if anyone should speak disrespectfully of the God of these 3 Hebrew young men, he should be torn limb from limb and his house turned into a dung heap. You see, he had met the right God, but he didn't know him very well. He was impressed with God's power, but all the other wonderful things about God's respect for freedom, he had that yet to learn. The only God I could trust and admire would be one who would allow me to make up my own mind, to be fully persuaded in my own mind. A God who would seek to win my trust, not to force me to love and trust him. A God who would terrify me by torture to agree with him. I simply couldn't admire him. I could only worship a God who would value my freedom as much as I do myself. And the other day I heard the Queen say, "The Commonwealth has always stood for freedom and for the dignity of the individual. Surely these are the things we prize the most." You'd think that the God of the Bible, as I read it, as I have described him, would be very much admired in England.
I should hope so there, Graham, but let me ask you a rather personal question here, if I may. What if you should find out at the end that God was rather like a divine Nebuchadnezzar, that he was arbitrary, vengeful, cruel, and very severe? If God was really like that, then what would you do?
Well, I certainly couldn't admire him. I couldn't trust him. I surely wouldn't like him. Might as well join the large group of disappointed people who seem to have decided these days that God is not worth thinking about at all. Fortunately, I don't believe there's a chance that this could be so. There's altogether too much evidence to the contrary. And that's why we're having these discussions, to take another look at God.
Let me go back to the question that we posed way back at the beginning. What would you say to the person that doesn't believe that there is a God at all there? How do you know that there is a God there, wherever?
Well, as you well know from your doctoral studies at St. Andrews, that question can lead to very complicated explanation. And I prefer the simpler answer that's given by many theologians, that there's no way we could know about God unless he, the infinite one, in his own time and in his own way, should choose to reveal or show himself to us. The question then is, has God revealed himself to us? And I have many friends trained in science and history who agree that God has indeed revealed himself in many and various ways, but most of all through the one called Jesus of Nazareth. But of course the next question is, how much can we know about him? Well, most of the information available about Jesus is to be found in the Bible, which then leads to another question. Can the biblical record be trusted? Are the books of the Bible reliable? But now we're dealing with something specific. We're dealing with documents of history. This we can investigate, and we can be satisfied.
But many people come to me and say, religion, the matter of the existence of God, those are something you take on faith. You have to believe. You just believe. You don't have to have these reasons and evidences. You just have faith.
Well, that is true for many. And since there is no investigation, no evidence, then there can be no investigation. Well, remember the worshippers of the Beatles. They had faith. They worshipped them in faith that the Beatles would help them. And then you think of the mother handing over her infant to the priest. She did it in faith that it was the right thing to do. And the priest who took the infant and handed it to this hideous god, he did it in faith. Maybe he was a father himself, but he believed it was the right thing to do. And then remember in the pictures of people being burned at the stake, the clergyman holding out the cross, they believed, they had faith that this was the right and proper thing to do. Recall all the things people have worshipped and believed through the years in faith. Remember the tragic story of Jim Jones and the 900 people who followed him in faith down to Guyana. And there all 900 of them drank cyanide in faith, and all of them died in faith in Jim Jones. There's a legendary definition of faith that a schoolboy is supposed to have given in days gone by, that faith is believing what you know ain't so. Now, I'm sure we'd hardly go that far, but is faith believing something for which you have insufficient evidence? If you had enough evidence, you'd say, I know. But I have to exercise faith because I don't have enough evidence. Does faith prove that something is so? If so, think of all the things that people have faith in.
You mention evidence in the Bible, but doesn't the Bible itself say that in matters of religion, these are things you simply accept by faith?
Oh, the Bible urges faith, of course, all the way through. But it's important to understand what the Bible means by faith. Mm-hmm. I suppose the most famous statement in the Bible on the subject is Hebrews 11:1, which is rendered in the King James, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But does it help to know that faith is a substance? This is difficult to understand. We know more about those words now, and so most modern versions read more like this. Faith is our assurance, or faith means being sure of the things we hope for. It's our conviction about things. It means being certain about things which we cannot see. It doesn't tell you where the faith comes from. For that we'd have to look, say, at Romans 10:17, where it says faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God, or hearing the message about Christ. Why hearing rather than studying? In those days there were no copies for study. You had to go and hear the Scriptures read out loud. So Revelation 1:3 said, blessed is he who reads out loud the words of this book, so that others may hear, because faith comes by hearing. In other words, faith in the Bible is conviction based upon evidence.
Now, what about feelings, the whole matter of the heart as opposed to the mind?
The heart is often mentioned in the Bible, but in the Bible the heart is more the inner man, the place where one does one's best thinking.
And what about the matter of faith as a leap in the dark, the voyage into the unknown, as people often say?
History is strewn with the wreckage of people who've been taking leaps in the dark. Besides, how ungrateful to suggest that God has left us in the dark. Christ came as light. We have the whole record of Scripture. How could we say that to trust God is to take a risky leap in the dark?
So then, one more time, what kind of person do you believe God to be?
I've written it out so I can give it to you just the way I want it.
Very good.
I believe that God is not the kind of person his enemies have made him out to be, arbitrary, unforgiving, and severe. Though infinite in majesty and power, our Creator is an equally gracious person who values nothing higher than the freedom, the dignity, and individuality of his intelligent creatures, that their love, their faith, their willingness to listen and obey may be freely given. This is the truth revealed through all the books of Scripture. This is the everlasting good news that wins the trust and admiration of God's loyal children throughout the universe.
And you really believe that?
That's what I find in the Bible.
But can the Bible be trusted?
That's our subject for next time.